we may start, as we have lots of work ahead. Please be welcome to this joint session of both the Committee of Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs and the JURI Committee, the Committee on Legal Affairs. We're about to hear from Commissioner-designate Mr. Didier Reynders, to whom we warmly welcome to this joint session. Please be welcome. This hearing is of the utmost importance for both of us committees, as justice portfolio fully falls into the competence of both of our committees, as it has been designed by the mission letter addressed by President-elect Ursula von der Leyen. It is only obvious that it falls fully within the competences of the LIBE Committee, Committee of Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs. As, first of all, portfolio is in charge of ensuring the rule of law effectively upheld in the European Union, including the proposed an enlarged European rule of law mechanism, which also affects democracy and fundamental rights, ensuring full respect of protection of fundamental rights enshrined in the Charter of Rights of the European Union, which entered into force along with the Lisbon Treaty 10 years ago, and its binding law according to the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice. It also affects the impact of the Charter of Fundamental Rights on privacy, according to the digital age, which is also one of the portfolios designed by President-elect Ursula von der Leyen in the future Commission. Also makes an impact on the work towards an effective implementation of data protection package as a consequence. And most importantly, when it comes to the Committee on Justice and Home Affairs, Civil Liberties, Fundamental Rights, Justice and Home Affairs, we have to make sure that we are ready to improve the state of judicial cooperation among the member states of the European Union, based on mutual trust and mutual recognition as enshrined in the Treaty of Functioning of the European Union, which is of the utmost importance, and proper implementation and enforcement of the EU law in our field of action, the development of the capacities of the agencies related to the LIBE Committee, which are numbering in 9, so your portfolio, justice portfolio, will create the conditions of an effective functioning of the European Public Prosecutor Office, which have completed the process to appoint the new head of the European Public Prosecutor Office, which is to be effective early in 2020. Then we will also be making sure that we contribute to a coordinated approach on the implications of artificial intelligence in our field of action and lawmaking, ensuring that company law promotes small and medium-sized business strategy, and effective international multilateral cooperation in the field of civil and commercial justice as well, timely and correct transposition and implementation and application of the Union law in all of the member states. So may I recall that this justice portfolio happens to be central to the strategic agenda of the Union in the coming years and challenge ahead to achieving European justice area, as it is the political will and the legal mandate of the area of liberty, justice and security, Title 5 of the Treaty of Functioning of the European Union, based, as I said, on mutual trust, mutual recognition, and in full compliance with the values enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, that is to say, the once called Copenhagen criteria, overcome throughout the process we discussed and we called the Copenhagen dilemma, as to binding principles and values and fundamental values which are binding law for all of the member states. and that the EU law is above in its field of action and binding to the member states. So I will now pass the floor to the co-chair of this joint session, Mrs. Lucy Netzinga, which is the JURI chair. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here, and I would also like to extend a warm welcome to Mr. Reynders. I hope that this will be a very productive session for all of us. I know that JURI are very pleased to be here sharing this session, and we will be particularly interested in the areas of consumer protection, which are very much part of this portfolio. I would like to focus on some of the procedural aspects for this morning's session. According to Annex 17 of the Rules of Procedure, which contains the guidelines for the approval of the Commission, Parliament will evaluate the Commissioners designate on the basis of their general competence, European commitment and personal independence, and it will assess the knowledge of their prospective portfolio and their communication skills. I would like to remind you that Parliament has submitted a preparatory questionnaire to the Commissioner designate with 2 common questions drafted by the Conference of Presidents and specific written questions. The Commissioner designate has replied in writing to the questionnaire, and the answers have been distributed to members in all languages. I would also like to remind you that the Committee on Legal Affairs, responsible for the declarations of financial interests, has raised no objection to the holding of this hearing. The debate will be structured as follows. The Commissioner-designate is invited to make an oral opening statement of no longer than 15 minutes. After that introduction, there will be time for 25 questions from the members. The debate will be held in accordance with the slots of 5 minutes each, with 1 minute for the question and then a 2-minute answer from the candidate Commissioner. In the case of a follow-up question, the question should not be longer than 1 minute, with 1 minute also for the reply. The first round of 7 questions will be asked by the coordinators of the political groups. The second round of 18 questions is based on the overall distribution of questions among the political groups, including a representative from the non-attached members. At the end of the hearing, the Commissioner-designate will have 5 minutes for a closing statement. Please be aware that we, as chairs, will have to be very strict in ensuring that the speaking time is respected. Otherwise, the last speakers will have no time left to ask their questions, and the Commissioner-designate will not be in a position to give justice to those questions either. Therefore, I will warn you that if you do exceed your time, we will be obliged to interrupt you, and I thank you for your understanding in this. Interpretation will be provided in 23 languages. You can therefore use your own language, keeping in mind that what you say needs to be interpreted, and therefore it would be helpful if you did not speak too quickly. The debate will be live streamed on the Parliament's internet site, and it will also be possible to access a video recording of the hearing on the same site. I will now hand the floor to Commissioner-designate Reynders for his presentation. Mr. Reynders, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Mesdames les Présidentes,
Co-chairs, members of Parliament, I'm very happy to be here to introduce myself to you this morning. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. I would like to talk to you today about how we're going to work together in the future if you put your trust in me within the framework of the mandate given to me by the President-elect, Mrs. von der Leyen. She has asked me to lead the Commission's work on rule of law, justice and consumer protection. As you know, I am a former Member of Parliament, and I have a deep respect for the role of the European Parliament. I think there is real value in your contribution to the European project. Let me begin my comments by a couple of thoughts of a more personal nature. The first, which is very important to me, is Europe's place in the world. 20 years ago, when I became minister for the first time, Europe was divided. It was trying to tackle the impact of the fall of the wall. Over the last 20 years, many things have changed, and we can be proud and happy, I think, of what we have achieved in Europe. We are carrying out policies and adopting legislation for the well-being of our citizens rather than fighting over territory. We have preserved our diversity through our cultures and our languages. If I am confirmed as European Commissioner, I make a commitment to work with you in order to deepen European integration. I am amongst those who want more and better Europe. If we want to have influence on the world stage in these changing times, the only way we can do this is by being united. The reality that we face is that the world around us is ever more divided and unstable. The values we hold dear are threatened by those who want to go back to a more nationalist discourse, a more populist discourse that should belong in the past. Our values are threatened by nations that want to dominate rather than cooperate. Our main goal is to try and protect what the European Union has achieved: peace, security and well-being. We also need to promote our common values, our support for multilateral institutions and sustainable growth and social progress. We should be determined when it comes to defending the rule of law, democracy and our fundamental rights. That means we need to do the same within the heart of the European Union as well. My second thought is even more personal to me. On Saturday, the 14th of September, I learned that serious accusations had been made against me by a person who was deliberately trying to damage my reputation. This person publicly stated that they wanted to stop me becoming European Commissioner. I denied all the allegations that appeared in the press. My lawyers got in contact with the prosecutors to have access to the file within this information procedure. On the 27th of September, the Crown Prosecutor, in full agreement with the Public Prosecutor, dismissed the case as there was no evidence of any wrongdoing. My lawyer will deal with the new allegations made by the same person in the same way. All of us, unfortunately, can be at risk of such malicious allegations, and I wouldn't wish on anybody what my family, those close to me, my children, my spouse have had to experience over these last 15 days. The rule of law also means the presumption of innocence, and I just want to be very clear with you about this particular matter. Ladies and gentlemen, exactly 20 years ago, in October 1999, Antonio Vitorino was named the first commissioner who had the portfolio of Justice and Home Affairs. I would just like to pay tribute to him, as well as his successors, particularly Mrs. Vera Jourova and Mr. Franz Timmermans, for their courage and determination. If I become commissioner, I will work very closely with them. I am delighted to have been put forward as President-elect to be the Commissioner designate for Justice, as well as consumer protection and respect of the rule of law. These three facets of the mandate are closely linked. They are built around the guiding principles of trust, inclusion and fairness. These will be key to these different policies and will guide my actions.
As for the rule of law, I believe that we must project our values outside of Europe. We must uphold them inside Europe. As Commissioner for Justice, I will work with the Vice President for Values and Transparency to ensure that the rule of law is upheld across the Union. I will work closely with the Commissioner in charge of Neighbourhood and Enlargement to ensure the consistency of the internal and external rule of law approach. This task is close to my heart. As Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs, I have called for a more active commitment of the European Union to protect and promote the rule of law. This is a prerequisite for our values. There can be no democracy and respect for fundamental rights without respect for the rule of law. Fundamental rights are effective only if they are protected by independent courts. Democracy is protected only if courts can ensure the respect of the freedom of expression, media pluralism and electoral rules. The rule of law creates mutual trust, so important for our internal market. Most importantly, respect for the rule of law is essential to ensure citizens' trust in the European project. Our responsibility is to preserve the rule of law in each and every member state. A number of ideas have been presented, including by this House, to give us the tools to deepen this work. In July, the Commission presented its proposals for a comprehensive European rule of law mechanism. I will promote a rule of law culture, prevent the development of rule of law concerns, and respond when necessary. I will lead this work and want to see this new mechanism up and running next year with an inclusive, non-discriminatory and preventive annual process. This will lead to an annual report and be backed up by the Justice Scoreboard. We must use all the tools at our disposal. The monitoring will cover all Member States, but will go in more depth in Member States where particular risks have been identified. I will pay particular attention to ensure the objectivity and fairness of this monitoring and how we build dialogue and ensure that we share best practice to help Member States. It is essential that the Parliament and the Council are fully involved. We also need to coordinate better with national parliaments. We have the same aims and ideals. Trust me, I will not hesitate to act whenever the rule of law is in danger. I will not compromise when democracy is at stake. Mesdames et Messieurs,
Members of Parliament, adapting our judicial systems to the changes we are seeing is a major priority for the decade to come. We need to strengthen cooperation in civil and criminal matters. European citizens have the right to live and work in the EU with the full respect of freedom of movement. It's also about respecting our diversity, but guaranteeing our different legal traditions at the same time. But this should not be a hindrance to our freedom or our security. I will work to build an atmosphere of trust between our different legal systems.
concerning the European arrest warrant, I will continue to monitor its application and work closely with you and with Member States to continue to improve it. We need to take a careful look at what needs to be done after the compliance assessment now underway. We will consider whether infringement proceedings are necessary. In light of the compliance assessment, I will also seriously consider whether to bring forward a proposal to revise the European arrest warrant. I will also look into how prison conditions in the Union could be improved, and I will explore the idea of establishing minimum standards for pre-trial detention in order to strengthen trust. Une tâche immédiate consistera à rendre opérationnel.
One immediate task will be to make the European Public Prosecutor's Office operational as soon as possible, and I welcome your role in getting an agreement on the public prosecutor. I recently was in contact with Mrs. Kovesi, and I'm sure she will be doing a very good job. It is important for us to incorporate new technologies so that we can modernise our legal systems. That's a major challenge. This is going to help us create a more effective legal system, one that's more accessible to our citizens. We have to ensure that the law is respected, but also that fundamental rights are respected. Europe is a world leader when it comes to data protection and respect of fundamental rights. One of my priorities will be to ensure that these fundamental rights are fully protected in the digital era. I will work closely with you in order to find the right balance here. We need to make sure that the new legal framework for data protection is fully implemented and at the same time continue to promote our values and our standards on the world stage. I will work with my colleagues on a coordinated approach when it comes to looking at the human and ethical implications of artificial intelligence. I look forward to the new possibilities opened up by these new technologies, but trust and safety have to remain our main priorities here.
Inclusion and fairness drive my approach to consumer protection. We can rightly be proud of the level of protection in Europe. We should not be complacent. We must continue to innovate and adapt to the rapidly changing environment and new technologies, offline and online. Our task is to work for fairness and sustainability in society, for the efficient functioning of the single market. This means looking more closely at both the supply and the demand sides of the business and consumer models. Company law can be a key tool to promote the shift to a sustainable economy. Consumers should be fully empowered, properly informed and encouraged to make sustainable choices. Consumers individually have little power, but together they are very strong if they can act on an informed basis. This purchasing power can help create a sustainable economy. That is why I will also push for swift adoption of the proposal on representative actions. Collective redress possibilities are very much needed by European consumers. We must continue to crack down on dishonest and aggressive selling and protect vulnerable consumers. We need to keep a high level of vigilance about the risk of dual quality products. It is unacceptable for consumers to be misled into believing a branded product is the same as elsewhere. We expect the same fairness wherever a consumer lives. The starting point must be that products we buy are safe, whether produced in Europe or elsewhere. I will look into updating the General Product Safety Directive so that all players in the online supply chain reduce the number of unsafe products. I also want clear rules in terms of liability for all providers involved in the online consumer journey. Finally, I intend to place particular emphasis on effective enforcement. A large amount of consumer law has been adopted in recent years. We now need to ensure it is effectively enforced both inside the Union and with our international partners. Mesdames les Présidentes,
Chairs, Members of Parliament, I have spoken a lot of our accomplishments over the last 20 years. I think we have the right to be proud of what we have achieved. We also have a duty to look to the future. That starts with listening, and I will be attentively listening to you all throughout my mandate. There are millions of young people who are out in the streets who are calling for a more sustainable future. They are a source of inspiration for us. They are calling on us to act. Together, I think we can achieve great things. I hope you will put your trust in me. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Designate Reynders. And now, as announced, we're about to get started with a round of questions up to a maximum of 25, all of them with the very same structure. It's going to be 1 minute of a question, then 2 minutes for a first answer, 1 minute for a reaction from the bench, every member, and then a final minute from Commissioner Designate to close the point raised in every single question. We're going to get started with the usual round of representatives of the political groups. 5 minutes each one of the members which are about to intervene, getting started with the EPP representative, Mr. Andrzej Haliki. You've got the floor.
Panie Przewodniczący.
Thank you very much, Chair. Indeed, Chairs. Congratulations on your appointment to this very important role. I'd like to start the round of questions with a pivotal, indeed an essential question. The Commission communication last week on the enhancement of community measures on the rule of law and possible responses. Respect for European standards and rule of law, as you rightly said, is essential for establishing a trust between the member states, and obviously this has a great impact on the rollout of all politics having to do with the smooth running of the authorities, the judicial authorities and so forth. And this also ties in with policy and internal market measures. How will you ensure the smooth running of the new mechanism for the rule of law in practice? How will you see to unity in this initiative when it comes to the rule of law, as you and we are all aware? some member states are undermining the judicial system. We have heard of various examples of interference in the legal system, cases of corruption, and indeed threats to the freedom of expression and threats to the plurality of the media. To your mind, how can we respond to these infringements against the rule of law when some member states just don't want to play ball?
The timing, the importance of the timing, because we've got work ahead and it's going to be scheduled for the next 2 hours and a half. So it's important that we all refrain ourselves to a first minute of a question, then respect the 2 minutes of an answer, and then final minute to react. Thank you. Yes, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Je remercie Monsieur Haliki pour ça.
Can I thank Mr. Halitsky for his question on the rule of law. The rule of law is going to be front and centre during my mandate, if I'm confirmed. For 3 years in Council I've been pleading for a peer review system on the rule of law. I know that this House in October 2006 produced a resolution on that subject, and the July report is very important as a part of the overall démarche. Step number 1 will be to get the Commission to produce a report on human rights. It's going to be not just rule of law, it will also be a wider area. And in the first year of the Commission, I would come back with a paper which would be a basis for discussion both in the Parliament and, I hope, in Council. But these are not instruments in the toolbox. You're asking for what else can be done. Article 7 has been triggered vis-à-vis 2 member states, Poland by the Commission, Hungary initially. After Parliament expressed a number of complaints, there is the infringement proceedings system vis-à-vis the Court of Justice, and it's also possible to attempt to dialogue with the countries concerned, and I would certainly do that. This would no doubt mean going to the countries concerned from the start of the mandate, because we can use the tools available. For example, the Venice Commission or GRECO to advance legislative proposals which are more in line with the realities. So rule of law is one thing, but there's a wide range of tools in that toolbox available to the Commission, and what I hope is that it wouldn't be necessary to embark on Article 7 because there are other ways to obtain satisfaction, but that will materialise in the course of the next few months.
You've got a second minute to react.
Chciałem dopytać na temat.
Thank you very much. Yes. I'd like to know what you intend to do in terms of monitoring exchange of information and establishing good practices, because when there are situations of risk, we have to act swiftly and tangibly.
Final minute, Commissioner Reynders.
Merci.
Thank you. There are other formats available. I've indicated infringement proceedings, for example, but there's a big debate which is currently underway on the multi-annual financial framework, the MFF. And against that backdrop, many have called, and I have, for conditionality between the MFF and rule of law. I believe that we'll get an agreement rapidly between the co-lawmakers on that subject, because this would then mean it was possible to take direct budget action with suspension or losing money altogether in the event of a generalised failure to uphold rule of law obligations. This is not something which is entirely in the hands of the Justice Minister. There are other departments. But conditionality, rule of law, is an important thing. And I take the point very well, Mr. Halitsky. It's necessary to respond in the event of failure to uphold.
And dear representative, Mr. Tierno Volken, you've got the floor for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reynders. Welcome to our hearing. I regret that you didn't mention corporate sustainability and due diligence in your first remarks. For us, transparency is a key element in ensuring corporate accountability for identifying and addressing risk of adverse human rights impacts, and as well as for fighting climate change and protecting the environment. The current EU non-financial reporting directive, which introduced the requirement for larger public companies operating in Europe to disclose information on environmental, social, human rights and anti-corruption matters, was a first step in the right direction, but has proven to be in serious need of revision in order to make it fit for the purpose. Are you going to present a legislative initiative amending the EU's non-financial reporting directive? And remember, today more than 84 civil society organizations are demanding action of the European Union. The S&D Group and I personally agree with them that we clearly need more than pure guidelines.
Thank you. Now, Commissioner Designate, you got 2 minutes to respond.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to say that I've mentioned our obligation to work on sustainability in my introductory remarks. I want to go maybe forward and further on that, Mr. Wolken. First of all, we are all committed as European Union, but our member states also, to fulfill our engagement about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals at the level of the UN. And you spoke about some actual regulations. There are different kinds of non-financial information requests to the listed companies. There are some specific elements, but it's true that in the company law, it's maybe important to go further, to go forward about different requirements. If we are organizing a real sustainable policy, we need to ask to all the companies to change maybe their way to think about the social interest. Social interest is not only a short-term vision for the shareholders and for the profit of the shareholders. It's also a medium and long-term vision. I mean, a vision about climate, about the local communities, about environment, about different other stakeholders than just the shareholders. And I'm very committed to work with you and with the Council about the way to install in the company law new requirements. You spoke also about human rights. It's the same. There are some voluntary commitment for the moment at the level of many companies, but it's not enough. I'm sure that we need to go to a real change in the company law to ask more obligations about the social interest of the companies. And I'm sure also that it's quite important to discuss about the supply chain. If you have the requirement for one company to explain a more medium and long-term sustainable policy, it's important to ask to such a company to verify what is the situation in the supply chain.
Now, Mr. Wolken, you got a minute again.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Reynders, as you avoided a clear answer, what concrete steps will you take to ensuring EU companies and those operating in the EU adhere to globally recognized human rights as well as to the protection of the environment? And what will you do to improve the access to judicial remedy for those who have suffered as a result of corporate malpractice by European companies and companies operating in the European Union? I really want that you today commit to a framework which gives European citizens clear rights and helps to ensure our globally and helps to ensure our to enforce treaties we entered on the global level, so EU, UN standards or OECD standards. So please make a clear answer to this follow-up question.
Your time again, Commissioner Designate.
My answer may be very clear. Is yes, I'm committed to do that, but I'm committed to do that in different kind of frameworks. I was talking about the company law. I was listening to your remarks about the capacity for the citizens to act. For the consumers, I will explain that maybe later. I'm sure that it's important to go to a collective redress, but I'm committed to work on the best legislative basis to be sure that for all the economic actors there is a real commitment to fulfill the engagement about the human rights And I'm sure that it's possible to do that in different legislative acts. But I'm very committed to do that, and my answer is very clear. You ask the question, do you will act on that? Yes, I will do that.
Now we move to Renew representative, Mr. Michal Smeka. You've got 1 minute for your question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Designate, for being here, and congratulations. Now, the rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights are all central to the development and survival of our pluralist societies. But what we see today is a number of governments in member states actually using their majorities to undermine pluralism and to cement their power through law. So the question and the problem clearly is broader than just the law, as you yourself have acknowledged. So as Commissioner responsible for this new comprehensive mechanism, would you also expand its title so as to cover the full scope of Article 2, namely democracy, the rule of law, and fundamental rights? And my second question is, would you agree that one of the reasons that the EU has been slow to respond to this problem is the many divergent approaches taken by the different EU institutions, many proposals, many ideas, many benchmarks? So are you committed to deliver one single mechanism which would involve all EU institutions and which would take the shape of a binding interinstitutional agreement along the lines proposed by the Parliament in 2016? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Reynders, you got 2 minutes for your question.
Yes, thank you for such a question about the mechanism and the ideal, the way to go to a very comprehensive approach about not only the rule of law, the fundamental rights and democracy. For the moment, we are in a situation with the communication of the Commission where it's possible to work on a report on the rule of law. In some extension, I spoke about media pluralism and democracy, but it will be a report on that. You know that there's also, in the intention of the Commission, a report on the Charter. Is it fundamental rights? So it's possible to come with also a report on that. We will work on a new strategy for the democracy, so maybe with a report also on democracy. So I will work on the rule of law as such, because you know it's a very long journey to organize such a process. We have discussed in some years here in this House, but also in the Council and in the Commission, about the way to organize such a process. But I'm sure that we need to work together. And to work together, that I mean maybe to organize a single one debate about all the different elements. The report on the rule of law, the report on the Charter, and maybe the report that we will have also on democracy. And if we are doing that, it's possible to discuss about an interinstitutional arrangement. A formal one, I don't know, because it will be long, maybe for a medium term, but to start immediately. And why not? I will propose that to organize a working group with the three institutions. The Council was discussing about a peer review, the Commission with such a kind of different report, and the Parliament with your text of October, I'm sure, 2016, and to see how it's possible to build together the process. Of course, I will work first on the report on the rule of law, but how it's possible to build a process with an interinstitutional discussion on the whole issue, the comprehensive issue, like you said, the rule of law, fundamental rights and democracy. So I'm hoping that it will be possible to start such a working group as soon as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Reynders. Mr. Smeka, you got a second minute to react.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the answers and the commitment to work with the European Parliament. And this should be in line with the promise or the commitment by the von der Leyen Commission as a whole to grant the European Parliament the right of initiative and follow up on its own legislative initiative reports by Article 225. Now, can you explicitly confirm that this will also apply to this issue and to the report that the Parliament has produced in October 2016? I'm asking because in the new Commission proposal and also in your written answers before this hearing, you kind of rejected the idea proposed by the Parliament for an independent monitoring group or independent panel of experts to evaluate the rule of law. Now, it is my understanding that the Commission frequently uses kind of the independent experts to underpin the enforcement of its various policies while retaining the overall political responsibility. So I can't see any kind of legal or practical obstacles for using the services of independent experts in this case. So would you agree that this independent review is essential for it to be objective and neutral?
Thank you, Mr. Smecker. Mr. Reynders, there you go again.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't have any problem to work with independent experts, and the Commission is doing that. We are working with the Venice Commission, with the Greco, with a lot of other group of experts. But there is a responsibility from the Commission in front of the Parliament. And so if you have a list of other independent bodies that it's possible to consult and to ask to give an advice about the rule of law, but also fundamental rights on democracy, I don't have any problem on that. The problem is to see if we install a new independent body with a responsibility and maybe without the same kind of approach. If it's to give to an independent body the full responsibility to express the view of the European Union, it's maybe strange, because that is the role of the Commission to come before the Parliament and the role of the Parliament to decide. And then, last remark, of course, if we have a real problem, there is another level, is the Court of Justice, and there it's possible to receive some standards. So I'm not against some possibilities to consult and to discuss with independent experts, independent bodies, but maybe not to create a new one.
Thank you, Mr. Reynders. Now it's the time of the Greens. Madame Saskia Bricmont, vous avez la parole.
Monsieur le Président, bonjour.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr. Reynders. The EU is a global actor. They have cooperation agreements in terms of trade, justice, police or migration agreements. You said in your written responses that we need to be promoting our standards and our values to our international partners, that you would focus on the internal and external dimensions of your mandate, that you wanted to improve judicial cooperation between European authorities and third countries, and that those people involved in criminal matters have to have their rights protected all along of the proceedings. My questions are: do you make a commitment to carry out a systematic impact assessment on the respective human rights under such agreements? How would you ensure these human rights are respected when we look at, for example, the negotiations between Europol and countries in the north of Africa? And how would you work with your colleagues when it comes to these agreements, trade agreements and migration agreements?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci, Madame Bricmont.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Mrs. Bricmont. Yes, I think it is a good idea to have impact assessments. I think we need to do that for a whole series of different initiatives that we're taking in the EU. I think that's the way we need to approach things when we are dealing with third countries. This is a commitment made by the President-elect, but I can also make this commitment in areas that fall under my remit. I want to inform Parliament and Council at each phase of the negotiations, and the impact assessment will, of course, be part of that analysis. I will do it, of course, first of all in the areas that are part of the justice portfolio, but it's clear that there is work to be done together with other commissioners within the Commission in the area of home affairs. You talked about the negotiations that Europol are having with a number of partners, and I think here we will have to pay very close attention to human rights as they fit into the final agreement. In the area of trade in the Council, I've often been part of such debates. I think it is important that we look more closely at human rights in trade agreements. This is a debate that has evolved over time, but it affects our policies that we maintain with third countries. We
Chers collègues, queridas y queridos colegas, cari colleghi, dear colleagues, please be seated. Please be seated and in silence so that we can resume our work the sooner the better. First of all, let me just tell you, as we told our Commissioner designate, to whom we apologize for this most unusual situation, that it was only not expected. It was completely an extraordinary situation. In years in this European Parliament, we had never seen anything like it. If you allow me, in Tenerife, we had a blackout of 9 hours. 1 million people under the impact of a total blackout last Sunday. So I was afraid that there was some kind of a curse that was causing this unexpected situation. But luckily, it was sorted out in less than feared, and we are here back to our work. But we have to expressly thank the ushers, who have really done their best to get this room ready in less than half an hour. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And now, if you agree, Commissioner Reynders, you were about to complete your 2 minutes of first answer to Madame Bricmont. Je crois que la chose à faire, c'est vous donner un...
I think we will finish with the question once again and then the answer.
Monsieur le Président, effectivement.
Chair, thank you very much to everyone for that organisation. I hope this wasn't any type of censorship. I heard your response and I appreciated your response, but I want to just give a couple of examples. There was a family of Uyghurs who were arrested, a minority which was persecuted in China. They were arrested in the Belgian embassy in Beijing, and there's been no reaction in the last 3 months from the Belgian authorities to the issue of family reunification. There's also been the cooperation of Belgium with the Sudanese regime when it comes to arresting and deporting those of Sudanese origin who are likely to be tortured and persecuted back in Sudan. So is that your idea of what it means to export our standards and values around the world? I am thinking particularly of Article 2 of the treaties. I do not doubt your European commitment, but I hope that you will stick very closely to respecting Article 2, respecting individual freedoms, equality, fairness, social justice. I hope these will be guiding principles in your future work as Conditioner within and externally as well.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Madame Bricmont, je peux...
Thank you very much, Madame Bricmont. I can tell you that I am very much committed to Article 2 being respected within the EU and also exporting our values. There was no arrest that took place in the Belgian embassy in Beijing. We are talking about a procedure of family reunification. I have to get the authorization of the Belgian authorities, but also a passport from the Chinese authorities. So we try to intervene systematically to ensure that we get this family reunification and contact with the family there and here as well in Xinjiang. As you know, we intervene regularly. You are clearly following our work in human rights, and so we act in Geneva, in the UN, in New York, wherever it may be. We are committed, and I think we will probably have time to discuss more in depth on migration policy, but I certainly believe we should respect fundamental rights and the values on which our union are based in all of our policies. Thank you.
Reynders. Now it's the turn for ID representative, Mr. Tom van den Duyche. You got 1 minute.
Goedemorgen, meneer Reynders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reynders. Your portfolio is overseeing rule of law and respect for the rule of law. And in 2004, the biggest party in the country, at that time an opposition country, was placed in a particular position and was sidelined. And we were trying to put in place taxation law which would have made it possible to crack down on tax evasion, there are ways in which millions can be diverted to Libya. And the whistleblowers have taken facts and figures into the public domain. And this was a process which has ran right up to the beginning of this hearing. Why do you think that citizens in Europe can trust you when it comes to protecting the rule of law and people's rights? Thank you.
Commissioner designate. Now your answer.
Dank u. Ik dank u.
Thank you very much for your question. I did indicate in my introductory remarks my views on a domestic situation here in Belgium. And I'm talking about rule of law in the European Union in its entirety and looking at the rest of the world. And I believe that an annual report on rule of law, which is a new mechanism, is the right way to go. And this will be done without any discrimination vis-à-vis any individual member states. And when it comes to Belgians and Belgium, this will be part of the annual report. And I think that's the best way, the best proof that you are defending the rule of law across all of the European Union for the past year and more. I have been making this proposal to get peer review, and I've been making that case to Council. And this would apply to every member state, not just individual ones. Of course, one will be particularly attentive where problems are evident, but it will be done without fear or favour and without discrimination. And there are judges, there's a judiciary in Belgium, they are doing their job. I think that the magistrates have a job to do, and I believe that we can do something very similar in many other countries, both within the European Union and outside. I've every confidence in our legal order and our judiciary in Belgium and indeed in other member states. And that's why I made such a major point of this early on.
Meneer Reynders, u zult tevens...
Thank you very much. You are also protecting civil rights, and the main one here is the freedom of expression and free speech. And this is something which has to be unassailable because it goes to the very heart of our democracy. In past years, we've been confronted with unwished and unrestrained mass immigration. People do not want that. And they say as much. They use their freedom of expression, they use their free speech to complain. And there are initiatives in the European Union seeking to criminalise freedom of expression there. Facebook is being called upon to censor content. And they talk about racism and hate speech, but that's not what it is. This is a restriction being placed on a fundamental right to free speech and freedom of expression. What initiatives would you take to make sure that a very broad construction would be placed on freedom of expression and free speech?
Meer algemene vraag in verband met...
Well, my portfolio also would extend to freedom of the press. And of course, individual citizens have got rights to freedom of expression. In the area of migration, it's possible to disagree. There are different views possible, not just in a national parliament, but this echoes throughout the European Parliament as well. But there are limits to that, so far and no further. This must not degenerate into racism. And there's a difference between having a view about the possible reasons. Do we want to open up to migration? That's one thing, but you can also deploy racism and xenophobia towards immigrants and migrants, and we must do everything one can to make sure that this dividing line is respected. Yes, people can have their views, people can disagree, and that's perfectly legitimate. But when this modulates into racism and xenophobia, of course, there is the criminal law which must come into play. And of course the judges are there to adjudicate.
To ECR representative, Madame Asita Kanko. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Het Europese aanhoudingsbevel is essentieel.
The European arrest warrant is essential to crack down on crime within the European Union. The European arrest warrant, together with national systems, I think is capable of improvement. And the European Parliament and indeed the Commission for years have worked on a revision of the European arrest warrant so that it can be proportionate in the way it's used. And digital systems have been introduced. And this is an opportunity for member states to act as well. But it's got to be honest and it's got to be proportionate. Mr. Reynders, can you give an assurance to this Parliament that the Commission would do everything in its power to ensure that it continues to work in a right and proper way and will respect the need for proportionality so that people can have trust and confidence in the legal system and to make sure that the legal system is not hollowed out?
Thanks, Mr. President. Ik dank u, mevrouw Kanko.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Kanko, for your question, which is very important in the cooperation between member states. It's a success story. I think that we have built up our capabilities, and it's quite right for us to remain attentive to proportionality and to the need for a balance. There has to be efficiency in our legal mechanisms and, on the other hand, defence of people's rights. And is a point which is worth repeating. There is a right to defence, and I believe that there is scope for improving the procedures. But there are now important rulings from the Court of Justice, and because of that I think a fresh light has been cast on the directive, and perhaps is going to be necessary to return that. How are things going to develop from here? At the beginning of next year there will be an assessment from the Commission on how the procedure is working, and I believe that we have got to go towards full and accurate implementation. It could well be that infringement proceedings are necessary before the court if those rules are not respected, but I believe that in the light of that assessment there will be a need for adjustments or course corrections, and I think that it's important to have majority support in the Parliament as well, so that this will strengthen the Commission's hand vis-à-vis the Council. This takes us back to the whole question of balance and proportionality. But I think that this can be pointed to as a real success story, if even simply on the numbers.
Dank u wel, meneer Reynders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reynders. I hear you talking about efficiency and how important that is. And in your mission statement, it talks about good cooperation between the different services, inter-service cooperation. And I'd like just to ask you to elaborate on how you intend to organise that when it comes to implementing very good rules which have been put in place to make sure that different law enforcement, judicial bodies are able to cooperate better together. For example, something which is very difficult, one hears this from Europol and from other organisations, it's difficult to undertake investigations and to get information, and in fact to have a proper exchange of information. And you talked about good cooperation in the judicial sector, and I think that smooth exchange of information is an important part of that. Implementation must be made more difficult rather than simply respect for the formal proprieties.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's true that ik wil zeggen dat is.
Thank you. It is true that we need to improve the exchange of information, and I think that a real role here for the Commission is one of verifying information and making sure that all of the, being the guardian of the treaties, the Commission is there to make sure that the EU rules are implemented. And with Europol, there are certain difficulties, and Europol and indeed Interpol on a broader scale. And certainly we must take a look at the correct implementation of the existing rules. There are proceedings vis-à-vis the Court of infringement proceedings are always possible before the Court of Justice if the rules are not being respected. And I believe that Eurojust, Europol are there, and perhaps the main job is to look at the proper implementation, to make sure the European Public Prosecutor's Office materialises. And on that basis, this will facilitate cooperation. More needs to be done on the training front. But proper implementation of all EU rules is essential. And I think that, are we there yet? Perhaps not. So we will have to make a big effort in that direction.
This first round of questions by the representatives of the different political groups, it's a time for the GUE. Madame Manon Aubry, vous avez la parole. 1 minute.
Bonjour, Monsieur Reynders.
Good morning, Mr. Reynders. I do not speak on my behalf or that of the GUI group, but around 80 organisations, they're going to publish a very clear request to the European Commission, they're calling for a European directive, and behind this there are thousands of victims who want justice for companies that are committing human rights violations. Companies such as Carrefour or Italians in Tarente, victims of pollution. And that is from the Lubrizol company in France. You have said that voluntary commitments are no longer sufficient. You now have the possibility as Commissioner to follow the steps that have been taken in France and really take these measures. We want a clear timeline to end the impunity for multinational companies.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. I want to help citizens when they are dealing with these companies. So a directive that would allow class actions for defending consumers, that's the example you've given. But I think we also need to be a lot more vigilant when it comes to defending citizens from violations, whether we're talking about workers within companies, for example, who are affected by these breaches of human rights. Now, you ask for a time frame. First of all, I'm going to very attentively read this proposal you say is coming tomorrow. I think that would be an important factor to consider. We can talk about that as well. I would like to see what the general feeling is, to see how far we can go in terms of voluntary commitments all the way to something in legislation. Now, you talk about due diligence when it comes to production and these companies. I mentioned this in my introduction. I think it's important that we can move forward having companies define medium-term and long-term objectives in terms of our environmental standards, human rights, and then to check compliance and to ensure that the entire supply chain is implicated here. do we need a legal obligation for due diligence here? Well, I will have a look at the proposal tomorrow. I know this is a focus here in Parliament, and we will certainly have a discussion about what steps can be taken here. I said this at the beginning of my comments. Clearly, voluntary commitments are not sufficient, and we will have to go further than this.
Reynders, Madame Aubry, encore une minute à vous.
Mrs. Aubry, another minute.
Ma question est pour aussi la.
So just to clarify, this isn't about asking companies, it's ensuring that victims have access to justice that currently don't. I noted in your written response that before allowing this access to justice, you had to evaluate the proportional nature of the different measures and the effect that this would have on competition for our industries. Now, what concerns me is that in Belgium, you supported a measure which allows companies to escape trials in certain cases. So you put the notional interest rate in place that allowed companies to pay less in terms of interest rates. So what you're talking about is allowing companies to be above the law. We want to end this impunity for multinationals. We want to allow access to justice for the victims. So stop placing companies above the general interest.
Votre tour de répondre.
Mr. Reynders?
Je ne considère pas qu'on doit passer les multinationales.
No, clearly, I do not think multinationals are above the law. Let's be very clear. They must submit to the law as anyone else. Now, you refer to proportionality, and clearly we do need to bear that in mind with regards to citizens, with regards to SMEs or larger companies. But I have a clear will here. I have seen, looking in different forums in the UN, for example, voluntary commitments are not sufficient. We need to go further than that, and we'll have to see how far we want to go here. So we'll have to look at the company itself, that will have to communicate certain information with regards to their social actions. So not just in the short term, but also in the medium and the long term. This has to incorporate human rights as well. And of course, there has to be access to information for the judicial system to guarantee the interests of citizens. So clearly, I do not agree that multinationals are above the law.
Now that'll do. That has made it complete, the first round of questions with the contributions and representatives of the different political groups. Now we're moving to the second round of questions from the bench. And I will be handing over the lead for this second round of questions to our co-chair, Madame Netzinger.
Thank you very much. So the first person in the second round of questions will be Mr. Emil Radev from the EPP. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Reynders, in your answers to the JURI written questions, you say that we need a coordinated approach in order to build mutual trust between the judicial systems. In a resolution of the 4th of July 2017, the European Parliament requested the European Commission to put forward a proposal for a directive on the common minimum standards of cross-border civil procedure. As rapporteur for the file, I believe that this is a way to build mutual trust between our systems. Do you intend to put forward such a legislative proposal? And if yes, when can we expect it? My second question. If you are elected Commissioner for Justice, will you propose a European strategy for combating corruption and organized crime in order to address the problem on a European level? Thank you.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Sorry. No, merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Radev, for the question. The question is the time frame. We need to work together with the proposal which came forward, as you said, in 2017. it will be necessary to build a majority in the European Parliament before taking the case, the argument, to Council. I've got some experience of Council, and I've sat through 41 successive presidencies, and I think perhaps that's where the biggest roadblocks are likely to be. When it comes to civil law procedures, I know there are strong hesitations, a lot of reluctance. How do you engineer a majority in Parliament which can then be replicated in Council or transposed there? It has to do with the President-elect and the right of initiative which was granted to the Parliament, because once it's there, the Commission can then pick it up and run with it under Article 225 in a spirit of sincere cooperation. Corruption and organised crime. The prime priority, the top priority there is now inscribed in the work of the future Commission, and that's the EPO, the public prosecutor. When it comes to protecting PIF, the financial interests of the Union, strong action will be needed to ensure that in 2020 the EPO is there and hits the ground running. And this will be the first time it's been possible to conduct investigations at EU level and launch investigations. At the same time, we can improve, as Mrs. Kanko said, our information exchange between different judicial systems to crack down on corruption and organised crime, which of course is extending its tentacles into ever more areas and domains. But at the EU level, clearly EPO is going to be an important step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reddow.
Thank you for your answers. My additional question is, what further measures do you envision to improve citizens' access to justice and improve judicial cooperation to ensure that our judicial systems can benefit fully from new technologies and innovation, and in this way help promote trade and investments? Thank you.
Mr. Radev, when it comes to access to justice, I clearly want that justice, that access, to be an independent right to take matters to court. And we need to be very vigilant, very attentive to make sure that justice is independent in all of the member states, with proceedings which have been underway for a long time now, against a rule of law background. And the independence of the judiciary is exactly what the scoreboard is, the justice scoreboard is for. But the justice programme, in budget terms, is designed to help member states and various players to have access to justice. What's needed is mechanisms to facilitate access to justice for citizens, perhaps co-financing and financial support from the Union to accompany the process, particularly for the more vulnerable players. I've seen that in Belgium. We have got mechanisms to provide active support to facilitate access to justice more directly. Exchange of best practice, informing people, awareness raising, and if necessary, providing active assistance. And that's what the justice programme within DG Just, with that envelope, it will be possible to go further down that track.
It's from Karen Barley from the S&D Group and the LIBE Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Reynders. In the last term, we have seen a very high priority for the Article 7 procedure in the Commission. And if I'm not mistaken, in your answering letter, Article 7 has not been mentioned one single time. What does that mean? Does that mean that you will handle the application of Article 7 differently than it has been handled in the previous Commission, than Frans Timmermans did? Less strictly, maybe. So my question is, how will you go on with the Article 7 procedures? I'm surprised.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, Mrs. Barley, very clear. I want to go forward with the Article 7 procedure, not only in the actual cases that we have, but it's needed in other cases. I know that there may be different kind of other problems in other member states. If it's needed, we need to apply in the same way. On the same basis that it was the case with Frans Timmermans, I want to repeat that I have seen very good report, detailed report, not only from the European Commission, but also from the Council of Europe, from different instances in the Council of Europe, to show that it was a necessity to start the procedure. And so I want to go forward on that. I've given us the answer, one of the first questions on the same issue, to say, no, it's a part of the toolbox. But we try now to implement other tools in the box. And the other tools are first the mechanism and the annual report that I try to prepare for the first year of the Commission, because it's important to have a procedure in the case of a very grave violation of the rule of law, but it's also very important to send recommendations to all the member states and to make some remarks to all the member states without any discrimination. I've said during many contacts with Parliament members, I was surprised during so many years that it was possible to make remarks on the budgetary situation. It's a necessity to do that, but not so evident to make remarks about the values that we are sharing. And that is very important. In the Council, with the peer review, in the Commission with an annual report, but I said also with a real debate in the Parliament. And so be sure that I want to go forward with all the tools in the toolbox, also the Article 7 for the current procedure that we have in the Council, and also for maybe others. And I want just to add that about Hungary, you have seen that it was a procedure now. I've asked in the Council, but it's also the position of the current Commission, that it will be possible for the Parliament to come and to explain the position of the Parliament, because the procedure was starting in the Parliament. And so, no, exactly in the same way, on a very solid basis. But of course, I've said in my first answer, we will also organize a dialogue with all the Member States to try to avoid any violation of the rule of law.
Thank you, Madam Bowley.
What you have referred to as well in the written answer as today is that you want to ensure that those involved in criminal proceedings have their procedural rights protected throughout the Union. What specific measures will you take or propose in that regard? And in your responses, you've also emphasized the need for reinforced judicial cooperation between member states and the possible expansion of the mandate of the European Public Prosecutor's Office. My question there is, do you believe that the Union law on procedural rights is sufficiently mature to allow for an all-powerful prosecutor at EU level without undermining the right for a fair trial? Would you agree that further measures to strengthen procedural rights of defendants are necessary if judicial cooperation between member states is to give way to supranational prosecutions by European prosecutors?
Yes, thanks, Madam Chair. Mrs. Barley, first of all, about the European Parquet, EPPO. My first preoccupation, my first concern is to be sure that we will have a correct implementation of the EPPO at the end of next year. And I will work with the Chief Prosecutor and the Administrator ad interim to do that. And we have a lot of steps to go in such a direction. I'm sure that we need to work on both elements that we have mentioned. First, there are a lot of things to do to have a better approach of a common set of procedural rules. It's not evident for the moment. We have different systems and we need to take care of the different systems, but the limit, and we have seen that during the procedure about Article 7, is to have a full respect for the rule of law. It's possible to have different procedures, but with a real independent justice and with a real capacity to protect fundamental rights in all the procedure. On the other hand, we need maybe to extend the competences of the EPPO. You know that we will try to work on an extension about terrorism. That's the first element. I don't know if it will be possible to do more than that, but if we are working on terrorism, cross-border not only on the protection of the financial interests of the European Union, it will be maybe needed to give new human resources, a new element in the budget for EPPO, because it's not exactly the same to work on the financial interest of the EU and on terrorism. But again, we need to work on both sides, because there are a lot of things to do to have a better approach of a common vision of the procedural rules, and then to extend maybe the competence of the EPPO.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Karen Melchior from the Renew Group. Commissioner, do feel free to answer the questions immediately and not wait for me. Just respond. It's absolutely fine. Karen.
Thank you very much. I will address the question of dispute resolution on platforms. The European Union must establish its own norms and direction for the digital space. With digitisation of everything from markets to democratic dialogue, European citizens are more and more obliged to resolve their disputes within the realm of a platform. Is it fair if you have a dispute with eBay or YouTube that the platform itself decides the dispute? Furthermore, these dispute regulation mechanisms are often based in non-EU countries with limited access to justice and rights for consumers and workers. Out-of-court dispute resolution is an important part of our justice system, but we are seeing a privatisation of a large part of our justice system. We must properly ensure consumer and fundamental rights of European citizens. Will the Commission put in place a European model of dispute resolution for platforms, inspired both by out-of-court mechanisms such as an independent ombudsman, which already exists for consumer rights in certain member states, as well as within the member states' formal justice systems?
First of all, Mrs. Melchior, I'll share your views that there is a problem with different platforms, and certainly also platforms coming from abroad, out of the European Union. So we need to take care of that. But when an online platform targets the consumer within the European Union, of course, the EU consumer rights apply, and we need to apply that. So this is the first answer. We need to take care of the right of the consumers on the basis of all actual legislation. And even if the platform is based outside the European Union, it's very clear. The second element, the Court of Justice have clarified what is it of targeting. Also, if you target one country, it's also a targeting, and so it's possible to react. And it's possible for all the citizens in Europe to have the possibility to seek out-of-court resolution, but with one of the, I've read, 460 different alternative dispute resolution bodies that we have inside the European Union. So it's the ADR directive. So we need to work on that. But it's true, it's maybe possible to go further, because it's impossible to say that the consumers need to go to maybe at the end the court to receive a positive answers. I want to mention two elements. First, I've said we will work on the possibility to have a collective redress and to have a directive on that. So maybe it's a first answer to give a capacity for a lot of consumers together to go to justice. The other side, I fully share the view that we need to think about new mechanisms. I don't want to give a concrete answer to say a mediator or something else, but we need to organize better the different kind of alternative dispute resolution inside the European Union, and maybe to send more and more information, because there's a lack of information, to the consumers, because they need to know that they have the capacity to go out of a platform coming from abroad and to go to an internal resolution mechanism. But I share the view that there are different problems with a platform from outside the European Union.
Thank you very much for your answer and your commitment to stop the privatization of our justice system. I was also happy to hear your commitment to reduce the number of unsafe products on online platforms earlier. However, online platforms do not only distribute tangible goods, but also creative content. It has already been established that unclear intermediary liability provisions in European law result in divergences, result in increased risks to fundamental rights and arbitrary decision-making. This impacts issues such as freedom of expression for European citizens on online platforms, especially when automatic decision-making, often referred to as filters, are used. how would you ensure that any kind of automatic technologies that may be mandated, directly or indirectly, respect fundamental rights and access to justice?
No, I want to say that you have seen that in the declaration of the elected president, there is a commitment in the first 100 days to work on an approach about the digital world. And it's such a part of the job, with many commissioners, and certainly with the executive vice president who's in charge of that, I will come with a proposal of legislative act about the human and ethical aspects of the artificial intelligence. And you mentioned the platform, but more than that, you mentioned the algorithm. What are the problems? First, to have a correct information. What is it? What is the logical system inside a possible application? Second, is it possible for the consumer to say, I don't want to be treated just by an automatic system, by a robot, by a machine. I want to have a human relation with somebody if I try to do something. And there are some possibilities to do that. But it's also very important that for the authorities, the national authorities in charge of the control, or the judges, to have the capacity to understand what has happened. Because if you don't receive enough information, if you don't have the capacity to test the different applications, you don't have the capacity to organize a real control and to decide about the protection of the consumers. So I'm sure that we will have a huge job in the first weeks to identify the best ways to protect such a human and ethical approach of artificial intelligence. I must say that I've seen that it was possible for many actors for the moment on the internet to take some decisions. Not enough. We need a legislative act.
It's from the EPP.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I shall speak Dutch. Ik zal Nederlands spreken.
I should be speaking Dutch. Just to pick up on artificial intelligence, which you've been commenting on, I understand that there is tremendous potential here and that there are advantages and no doubt there are drawbacks. For example, safety in autonomous vehicles and self-driving cars and other things besides. For the time being, there is no actual European legal framework. And I think that is a danger. Having unregulated artificial intelligence may well pose a threat in the absence of a framework. And the danger, of course, is that individual member states are going to go it alone and produce their own legal framework. And you've talked about working together with Commissioner Designate Vestager. Can I just ask you, how long is that going to take? Is it going to be sector specific? Is it going to be horizontal? What kind of legal framework would there be? The competitive edge of companies. They need access to big data. It's necessary to make sure that people's personal data is properly protected. And is this an area where Europe is going to exercise a monitoring function or control? Thank you very much, Mr. Peters. I did suggest what the first steps in this area or in the first 100 days with the entire college, and it would be to go towards a new framework. I think that our society needs updating, modernisation, and I think that it would not be an easy undertaking. But Mrs. Melchior, I think, has given us some ideas about how that might look. I think one is looking at the first 100 days. One would look at the first 100 days. And I think that the legal framework would be a very horizontal one, but not one which is ignorant or unaware of sectors, because there is, for example, transport, there is health, where it's clearly going to be necessary to take measures which are harder hitting and more precise. Liability. Where does the responsibility lie? For example, self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles. imagine here in Brussels there is an accident. Who is responsible? Who's liable? Is it the owner? They haven't done anything necessarily. Is it the manufacturer? Perhaps. But it might be a number of individuals who are busy with new applications and new technologies. And I think that we may need to refresh our eyes when it comes to, is there a need for the legal framework to move with change? It's certainly going to be necessary to begin with a detailed analysis so that we can be sure that it's possible to identify the locus of responsibility and liability when there are so many links in that chain.
Dank u wel voor het antwoord. Een bijkomende vraag is...
Thank you very much. The analysis suggests that towards 2030, 70% of the economic advantages, the benefit, the profit, is going to accrue to China and the US. And why is it, the figure is 70%, 70, why is it that the way things look, the benefits are going to flow to those major competitors?
Percentage is more.
I share your analysis. I wouldn't pin myself down to a number. I think that we're having to move towards renovation and modernisation. At the European summit in Lisbon more than 20 years ago, even then people were saying, in 10 years' time we want to be world beaters and world leaders. But of course things have moved on. We began to work towards 2020. We're almost there now. And I think that what we have to do is to provide more support, give a boost to innovation, to startups, and also to work on the standards for the right approach to protect human rights and fundamental rights. There's another important area which is data protection, and the Parliament has got a very substantial track record in that area. I think, with the standards, the same standards, can bring to bear pressure, can exert pressure on the Americans because of our track record in standard setting. And what we need is proper synergies between innovation and defending fundamental rights. And I think that there we've got a comparative advantage vis-à-vis everyone else.
Thank you very much. The next question now is from Madame Wolters. Ja, welkom meneer Reynders.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Mr. Reynders.
About cycling, actually. But since cycling is probably not in your folders, I'll help you a little bit. The question is also about collective redress. And the context here is a number of scandals that we've had over the past years, I should say, at Ryanair, for instance, with Dieselgate, with faulty breast implants. And the European Commission has made a proposal on collective action in such cases so that citizens, EU citizens together, can seek justice. But let's zoom in on Dieselgate for a moment now.
Concrete, Mrs. Wolters, I want to say that, of course, we need first to adopt the new directive, the Representative Actions Directive, to organize a collective redress, because you know that we need to go to a Council position, if it's possible, in November. So we are